Throughout history, there have been countless tales of unimaginable evil. But some of the most chilling stories come from the most unexpected places. These women seemed ordinary at first: mothers, wives, and caregivers. But behind closed doors, they hid a darkness that would send shockwaves through the world. From poisoning and torture to cold-blooded murder, they left a trail of terror that would change lives forever. Also known as the Giggling Granny, Nanny Doss confessed to killing at least 11 people, including her husbands, children, and lovers, from the 1920s to the 1950s. Nanny Doss, born Nancy Hazel on November 4, 1905, was an American serial killer who was responsible for the deaths of 11 people between 1927 and 1954. She became infamously known by various nicknames, including the Giggling Granny, the Lonely Hearts Killer, the Black Widow, and Lady Bluebeard. Her murderous spree came to light in October 1954 when she confessed after the death of her fifth husband in a Tulsa, Oklahoma hospital. It was ultimately revealed that Doss had killed a total of 4 husbands, 2 of her children, 1 sister, her mother, 2 grandsons, and a mother-in-law. Nanny Doss was born on November 4, 1905, in Blue Mountain, Alabama, now part of Anniston, to Louisa Lou, née Holder, and James F. Hazel. She had 1 brother and 3 sisters. Both Nanny and her mother resented James, who was a controlling and abusive husband and father. He forced his children to work on the family farm and did not allow them to attend school, which contributed to Nanny's struggles with academics. At age 7, while traveling with her family to visit relatives in southern Alabama, Nanny was injured when the train suddenly stopped, causing her to hit her head on a metal bar on the seat in front of her. This accident left her suffering from severe headaches, blackouts, and depression for years afterward, which she later blamed for her mental instability. As a child, Nanny loved reading her mother's romance magazines and fantasizing about her own romantic future, particularly enjoying the Lonely Hearts column. However, her father imposed strict rules, forbidding his daughters from wearing makeup or attractive clothing, believing it would protect them from being molested by men. He also prohibited them from attending dances and other social events. At the age of 16, Nanny Doss married Charlie Braggs, a co-worker from the linen factory where she worked. With her father's approval, they married after only 4 months of dating. Braggs was the only son of a single mother who insisted on living with him even after the marriage. Nanny later wrote about the experience, explaining that she married as her father wanted, to a boy she had known for just a few months, and that his mother, who was unmarried, took complete control of their lives once they were married. She described how Braggs' mother wouldn't even allow Nanny's own mother to stay overnight. Braggs' mother demanded most of his attention, severely restricting Nanny's freedom. The couple had 4 daughters between 1923 and 1927, but the marriage was troubled. Nanny turned to drinking, and her occasional smoking habit became a heavy addiction. Both Nanny and Braggs suspected each other of cheating, and Braggs frequently disappeared for days at a time. In 1927, tragedy struck when their 2 middle daughters died from suspected food poisoning. Soon after, Braggs fled with their eldest daughter, Melvina, leaving Nanny behind with their newborn daughter, Florine. Braggs' mother died shortly after his departure, and Nanny found work at a cotton mill to support herself and Florine. The following summer, in 1928, Braggs returned with Melvina and a divorcee who had a child of her own. Nanny and Braggs divorced soon after, and Nanny took her 2 daughters back to live with her mother. Braggs always claimed he left because he was afraid of her. Nanny Doss married her second husband, Robert Franklin Harrelson, in 1929. The couple settled in Jacksonville with her 2 daughters, Melvina and Florine. Not long into the marriage, Nanny discovered that Harrelson was an alcoholic with a history of criminal behavior, including an assault conviction. Despite these issues, their marriage endured for 16 years. In 1943, Melvina gave birth to a son, Robert Lee Haynes. 2 years later, she had another baby, but the infant died shortly after birth. Groggy from labor and under the effects of ether, Melvina thought she saw her mother, Nanny, insert a hatpin into the baby's head. When she asked her husband and sister about it, They said Nanny had told them the baby had already passed away, and they noticed she was holding a pin. However, the doctors couldn't confirm what had happened. The loss of the baby caused tension between Melvina and her husband, and the couple began to drift apart. Melvina eventually started dating a soldier, whom Nanny disapproved of. While Melvina was visiting her father after a heated argument with Nanny, her son Robert mysteriously died while in Nanny's care on July 7, 1945. His death was attributed to asphyxia from unknown causes, and 2 months later, Nanny collected the $500 life insurance policy she had taken out on Robert. In 1945, after Harrelson raped Nanny, she retaliated the next day by poisoning his jar of corn whiskey with rat poison. He died later that evening. Nanny met her third husband, Arlie Lanning, through a Lonely Hearts column while she was traveling in Lexington, North Carolina. They married just 3 days after meeting. Like her previous husband, Lanning was an alcoholic and a womanizer. However, this time it was Nanny who frequently disappeared for months at a time. When she was home, she played the role of a devoted housewife. When Lanning died, reportedly of heart failure, the townspeople sympathized with her and supported her during the funeral. Shortly after his death, the couple's house, which had been left to Lanning's sister, mysteriously burned down. The insurance payout went to Nanny, who quickly deposited the money. After Lanning's mother also died in her sleep, Nanny left North Carolina and moved in with her bedridden sister, Dovey, who died shortly after Nanny's arrival. Still seeking another husband, Nanny joined the Diamond Circle Club, a dating service, and soon met Richard L. Morton of Jamestown, North Carolina. They married in 1952 in Emporia, Kansas. While Morton didn't have a drinking problem, he was unfaithful. Before poisoning him, Nanny first poisoned her own mother, Louisa, in January 1953, shortly after she moved in with them. Morton died 3 months later, on May 19, 1953. Nanny's fifth marriage was to Samuel Doss, a Nazarene minister from Tulsa, Oklahoma, whom she married in June 1953. Samuel had lost his family in a tornado in Carroll County, Arkansas, and he disapproved of the romance novels and stories that Nanny enjoyed. In September, Samuel was hospitalized with flu-like symptoms and was diagnosed with a severe digestive tract infection. He recovered and was discharged on October 5, but died a week later on October 12, 1954. Nanny had poisoned him, eager to collect the 2 life insurance policies she had taken out on him. His sudden death raised suspicion, and an autopsy revealed a large amount of arsenic in his body. Nanny was arrested shortly afterward. Nanny Doss eventually confessed to murdering 4 of her husbands, as well as her mother, sister, grandson, and mother-in-law. However, the state of Oklahoma focused its case solely on the murder of Samuel Doss. J. Howard Edmondson, who would later become the governor of Oklahoma, prosecuted the case. On May 17, 1955, Nanny pled guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. The death penalty was not sought due to her gender. Despite her confessions, she was never charged for the other murders. Nanny Doss died of leukemia in the hospital ward of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in 1965 and was buried at Oak Hill Memorial Park in McAlester, Oklahoma. Known as the Highway Killer, she murdered 7 men in Florida in 1989 to 1990. Her case became infamous due to the nature of her crimes and her troubled life, which was later depicted in the film Monster. Aileen Wuornos is one of the most infamous female serial killers in U.S. history. Born on February 29, 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, Wuornos had a troubled and abusive childhood. Her mother abandoned her when she was young, and she was raised by her grandfather, who reportedly sexually abused her. She turned to prostitution at a young age, which was a path that would lead to her eventual crimes. Wuornos' killing spree began in 1989. Over a span of about 1 year, she murdered 7 men, all of whom were middle-aged or older men who had offered her a ride while she was working as a prostitute on Florida highways. Wuornos claimed that she killed the men in self-defense after they had either attempted to assault or actually assaulted her. She often shot her victims at close range, stealing their money and belongings after killing them. The first murder occurred in December 1989 when she shot and killed Richard Mallory, a man who she said had tried to rape her. Wuornos then continued her killings throughout 1990, murdering 6 more men in similar circumstances. Her final victim was 65-year-old Frederick Dick McKinney, whom she shot and killed in November 1990. Her capture came in January 1991 when police traced the murder victims to her through the stolen cars they found. After a series of interrogations, Wuornos confessed to the murders. She was arrested and charged with the killings, eventually being convicted for 6 of the murders. Her trial was highly publicized, and she became a notorious figure due to her violent actions and the media's portrayal of her as a female serial killer. Wuornos' defense team argued that she had been the victim of sexual violence and that she had acted in self-defense. However, the jury convicted her of first-degree murder, and she was sentenced to death in 1992. Aileen Wuornos spent over a decade on death row at Florida State Prison. During this time, she was the subject of extensive media attention, and her case was covered in documentaries, interviews, and even a 2003 film Monster, where actress Charlize Theron portrayed her. Wuornos' mental health was often debated, with some arguing that she was suffering from severe emotional and psychological trauma, while others believed she was simply a ruthless killer. She was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002, after spending over a decade on death row. Wuornos' story remains a tragic and complex one, as her history of abuse, trauma, and her extreme actions continue to spark debates about mental illness, the criminal justice system, and the nature of female violence. A Norwegian-American serial killer who is believed to have killed up to 40 people, including her children and lovers, in the early 1900s. She lured men through personal ads, then murdered them for insurance money. Belle Gunnes, born Brynhild Paulsdatter Sturseth on November 11, 1859, was a Norwegian-American serial killer who operated in Illinois and Indiana between 1884 and 1908. Nicknamed Hell's Belle, she is believed to have killed at least 14 people, mostly men whom she lured to her rural Indiana farm through personal ads. Some sources suggest she may have been responsible for as many as 40 murders, making her one of the most notorious female serial killers in history. Gunnes is thought to have died in a 1908 fire, but her true fate remains a mystery. Belle Gunnes, born Brynhild Paulsdatter Sturseth on November 11, 1859, in Selbu, Sør-Trøndelag, Norway, was the youngest of 8 children born to Paul and Berit Sturseth. She was confirmed in the Church of Norway in 1874. At 14, she began working on nearby farms, milking cows and herding cattle, to save enough money for her trip to New York City. She immigrated to the United States in 1881. Upon arriving at Castle Garden Immigration Station, Gunnes changed her first name to Belle and then traveled to Chicago to join her sister, Nellie, who had moved to the U.S. several years earlier. In Chicago, Belle lived with her sister and brother-in-law, working first as a domestic servant and later at a butcher's shop, where she cut up animal carcasses. Standing at least 5'7", 170 centimeters, and weighing between 210 to 250 pounds, 95 to 113 kilograms, she was physically strong and imposing. Belle Gunnes married Mads Didlev Anton Svensson in 1884, and the couple ran a candy store, which later burned down. Their home also caught fire, with both incidents resulting in insurance payouts for the couple. 2 of Gunnes' babies died from inflammation of the large intestine, a condition that can be caused by poisoning. Both children were insured, and Gunnes collected substantial insurance checks after their deaths. Neighbors were suspicious, as Gunnes never seemed pregnant during the pregnancies. Svensson had taken out 2 life insurance policies, and on July 30, 1900, both policies were active at the same time, one expiring that day and the other coming into effect. Svensson died from a cerebral hemorrhage on that same day. Gunnes claimed he came home with a headache, and after giving him quinine for relief, she later found him dead. She collected a total of $5,000 from the 2 life insurance policies. With this money, she moved to LaPorte, Indiana, and purchased a pig farm. Belle Gunness married Peter Gunness on April 1, 1902. Just a week later, while Peter was away, his infant daughter died under mysterious circumstances while in Belle's care. 8 months after their marriage, Peter died from a skull injury. Belle claimed that while reaching for something on a high shelf, a meat grinder fell on him, causing the fatal injury. The district coroner convened a jury, suspecting foul play, but no action was taken. Belle received $3,000 in insurance money following Peter's death. Belle Gunness began placing marriage advertisements in Chicago newspapers in 1905, one of which was responded to by Henry Gerholt, a farmhand from Wisconsin. After traveling to LaPorte, Gerholt wrote to his family, saying he liked the farm, was in good health, and asked them to send seed potatoes. However, when the family never heard from him again, they contacted Gunness, who claimed that Gerholt had left with horse traders for Chicago. She kept his trunk and fur overcoat. In 1906, John Moe from Minnesota responded to another of Gunness's ads. After corresponding for several months, Moe traveled to LaPorte, where he withdrew a large sum of cash. He was never seen again. A carpenter who occasionally worked for Gunness noticed Moe's trunk was left behind at her house, along with more than a dozen other trunks. Belle Gunness's criminal activities were uncovered in April 1908 when a fire destroyed her farmhouse in LaPorte, Indiana. Amid the ruins, authorities discovered the body of a headless adult woman, initially believed to be Gunness, along with the remains of her 3 children. Further investigation on the property uncovered the partial remains of at least 11 other individuals. The discovery was brought to light when Azel Helgelien contacted the LaPorte police after finding letters between his brother, Andrew Helgelien, and Gunness, in which Andrew was urged to move to LaPorte, bring money, and keep the move secret. Azel, accompanied by a former worker from the farm, visited the property and noticed soft depressions in a former hog pen. Digging into one of these depressions, they found a gunny sack containing human remains, which Azel identified as his brother's. Continued digging around the property uncovered numerous other graves, with burlap sacks containing dismembered body parts, torsos, arms, hands, and legs often severed in a similar manner. Decapitated, limbs removed at the shoulders and knees, and skulls showing signs of blunt trauma. Over the course of 2 days, the police found parts of at least 11 bodies, some buried in shallow graves near the hog pen, an outhouse, or a lake. This discovery caused a dramatic shift in how Belle Gunness was viewed. Initially, she had been portrayed in the media as a woman who perished in the fire while trying to save her children, but with the unearthing of the bodies, her true nature came into focus. While some remains were identified, many could not be linked to missing persons, despite a growing number of inquiries from families of men who had disappeared. Ray Lampher was Belle Gunness' hired hand and occasional lover. In November 1908, he was convicted of arson for setting the fire that destroyed Gunness's house. Lampher later confessed that Gunness had placed personal ads seeking men, whom she would then murder and rob after they visited her farm. He also claimed that she had instructed him to burn down the house with her children inside. Lampher asserted that the body found in the fire, thought to be Gunness's, was actually that of another victim, planted to mislead investigators. He explained that Gunness had been warned that the brother of one of her victims might visit to investigate his disappearance, which led her to destroy her house and fake her death to escape. When arrested, Lampher was found wearing John Moe's overcoat and Henry Gerholt's watch. Journalist Edward Beckley was tasked with obtaining and publishing a confession, and he later revealed a second, contradictory confession from Lampher. This confession was transcribed by Skell, Lampher's attorney, but Beckley was initially denied the right to publish it. Eventually, another newspaper published speculation about the second confession, which was later offered to Beckley and printed. Lampher's confession led to the arrest of his accomplice, Elizabeth Smith. Despite the discovery of the headless body, Gunness was officially declared dead, although the doctor who examined the remains noted that the body was shorter and lighter than Gunness, and the head was missing. Whether she died in the fire or escaped remains uncertain, though the sheriff criticized a reporter from the Chicago American for fabricating the escape story. Over the years, Reported sightings of gunnists continue, especially in the Chicago area. In 2008, DNA tests were conducted on the headless corpse in an attempt to compare it to a letter gunnists had sent to one of her victims. But the sample was too degraded for conclusive results. After her crimes were discovered, the Gunness farm became a macabre tourist attraction, drawing visitors from across the country who came to see the mass graves, with souvenirs and concessions sold at the site. An Italian serial killer known as the soapmaker of Correggio, Cianciulli murdered 3 women in the 1930s and made soap and tea cakes from their bodies. Leonarda Cianciulli was born in Montella, Avellino, in what was then the Kingdom of Italy. She attempted suicide twice during her youth. In 1917, she married Raffaele Ponsardi, a registry office clerk, despite her mother's disapproval, as she had hoped to marry her to another man. Cianciulli later claimed that her mother cursed their marriage. In 1921, the couple moved to Ponsardi's hometown of Lauria, Potenza, where Cianciulli was sentenced to prison for fraud in 1927. After her release, they relocated to Lacedonia, Avellino. Following the destruction of their home in the 1930 Irpinia earthquake, they moved again, this time to Correggio, Reggio Emilia, where Cianciulli opened a small shop. She became well-liked and respected within her community. During her marriage, Cianciulli had 17 pregnancies, but she suffered 3 miscarriages, and 10 of her children died young. As a result, she was extremely protective of her 4 surviving children. Her anxieties were heightened by a warning from a fortune teller who predicted that she would marry and have children, but that all of her children would die young. Additionally, she consulted a Romani palm reader who told her, "In your right hand I see prison, in your left a criminal asylum." In 1939, Cianciulli discovered that her eldest and favored son, Giuseppe, was about to join the Royal Italian Army in preparation for the Second World War. Obsessed with protecting him, she became convinced that the only way to ensure his safety was through human sacrifice. She selected 3 middle-aged women from her neighborhood as her victims. Cianciulli's sister-in-law, Albertina Fanti, became suspicious when she noticed the sudden disappearance of one of the victims and recalled seeing her enter Cianciulli's house. Fanti reported her concerns to the police, leading to an investigation and Cianciulli's arrest. It wasn't until the authorities began suspecting her son, Giuseppe Ponsardi, that Cianciulli confessed, providing detailed accounts of the murders to protect him. During her 1946 trial in Reggio Emilia, Cianciulli remained unrepentant and even corrected the prosecutor on certain details. With a strange sense of pride, she remarked, "I gave the copper ladle, which I used to skim the fat off the kettles, to my country, which was so badly in need of metal during the last days of the war." Cianciulli was convicted and sentenced to 30 years in prison and 3 years in a criminal asylum. She passed away from cerebral apoplexy in 1970 at the Women's Criminal Asylum in Pozzuoli. Artifacts related to her case, including the pot used to boil her victims, are displayed at the Criminological Museum in Rome. A darkly comedic play titled Love and Magic in Mama's Kitchen, based on Cianciulli's story, was first staged by Lena Wertmuller at the Spoleto Festival in 1979 and later ran on Broadway in 1983. An American serial killer who ran a boarding house in Sacramento, California, poisoned and murdered at least 9 elderly and disabled tenants in the 1980s. Born in 1929 in Redlands, California, Dorothea Helen Poon had a difficult childhood, marked by an unstable family environment. Her mother died when she was young, and she was placed into foster care. As an adult, Poon had several failed marriages and struggled with alcohol and drugs. She found her niche in the world of care for the elderly, eventually opening a boarding house in Sacramento, California, where she would house elderly and mentally disabled tenants. In the 1980s, Poon ran a boarding house in Sacramento, where she provided care for elderly or vulnerable tenants. She was well-liked by many of the people in the neighborhood and built a reputation as a kind, grandmotherly figure. However, she had a dark side. Poon began to take advantage of her tenants, many of whom were elderly or had mental disabilities. She would convince them to sign over their Social Security checks, claiming to help them with their finances and then pocket the money herself. In some cases, she would drug her tenants, and it is believed that she may have killed them to continue collecting their benefits. Punt's crimes began to surface after tenants began to disappear mysteriously. Several residents of her boarding house vanished without a trace. One of the first to raise suspicion was an elderly man named Henry B., who disappeared in 1982. After that, others started to vanish, including a woman named Dorothy Miller and a disabled man named Benjamin Fink. The neighbors had grown suspicious of Punt's behavior, especially when she was seen digging in the backyard at odd hours of the night. When a social worker investigating the welfare of one of the residents was told by a neighbor that they hadn't seen the person in a while, they decided to look into the situation further. In 1988, a police investigation was launched when a parole officer discovered a tenant named Betty Palmer was missing. The investigation led authorities to Punt's property, where they unearthed the bodies of several people buried in the backyard. The remains of 9 individuals were found, some of whom had been poisoned or strangled. Investigators believe Punt may have killed many more, as she was known to have moved frequently and had other boarding houses. Punt was arrested in November 1988 after her property was searched, and she was charged with multiple counts of murder. She was convicted of 3 murders, though authorities suspect her of up to 9. Punt was ultimately convicted in 1993, and she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During her trial, Punt claimed that she was not responsible for the deaths, instead blaming her tenants' deaths on overdoses or natural causes. Punt spent the rest of her life in prison and died on March 27, 2011, at the age of 82. She had been serving her sentence at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, California. Though Dorothea Punt is most widely known for her murders, she left behind a legacy of how she manipulated and abused vulnerable people under the guise of being a caretaker. Punt's case remains one of the most chilling examples of elder abuse and manipulation. She exploited the trust of her tenants, many of whom had no families or anyone to watch out for them, and she turned their deaths into a way to profit. Her story is a tragic reminder of how people can hide their darkest secrets behind a facade of kindness and caregiving. An American nurse who confessed to killing over 30 people in the late 1800s. She is believed to have used poisons to kill her victims, including patients in her care. Jane Toppin, originally named Honora Kelly, was born on March 31, 1854, in Boston, Massachusetts, to Irish immigrant parents. Her mother, Bridget Kelly, passed away from tuberculosis when Jane was very young. Her father, Peter Kelly, was an eccentric and abusive alcoholic, known as Kelly the Crack. In later years, he was said to have sewn his own eyelids shut while working as a tailor. In 1860, after the death of his wife, Peter Kelly sent his 2 youngest children, 8-year-old Delia and 6-year-old Honora, to the Boston Female Asylum, an orphanage for poor girls. He never saw them again. Records from the asylum describe the children as being rescued from a very miserable home. While little is known about their time there, it is reported that Delia became a prostitute, and their older sister Nellie, who had not been sent to the asylum, was placed in an insane asylum. In November 1862, less than 2 years after being abandoned by her father, Honora was placed as an indentured servant in the home of Mrs. N.C. Toppin in Lowell, Massachusetts. Though she was never officially adopted by the Toppin family, Honora took on their surname and became known as Jane Toppin, distancing herself from her troubled past. She got along well with the Toppins' biological daughter, Elizabeth. In 1885, Jane Toppin began nursing training at Cambridge Hospital, where she was well-liked and earned the nickname Jolly Jane. However, she secretly experimented on her patients, particularly the elderly and sick, by altering their medication with morphine and atropine to study their effects on the nervous system. Toppin spent time alone with patients, faking medical records, and even climbing into bed with them. Toppin's career progressed when she was recommended to Massachusetts General Hospital in 1889, but she was dismissed the following year for reckless drug use. After returning to Cambridge and being dismissed again, she worked as a private nurse, despite complaints of petty theft. In 1895, She began her murder spree, starting with her landlord, Israel Dunham, and his wife. She killed her foster sister Elizabeth in 1899 and later moved in with the Alden Davis family in 1901, where she murdered several members, including Davis, his sister, and 2 daughters. A toxicology test on one of the victims led to an investigation, and on October 29, 1901, Toppin was arrested. By 1902, she confessed to 31 murders. She also stated that she wanted the jury to find her sane, believing that her awareness of her actions meant she was not insane. Nonetheless, she was declared insane and committed to the Taunton Insane Hospital, where she died on August 17, 1938, at age 84. An article from the Hoosier State Chronicles, published shortly after Jane Toppin's arrest, reported that she would fondle her victims as they died and claimed she sought to view the inner workings of their souls through their eyes. During questioning, she admitted to experiencing sexual excitement from witnessing her patients near death, bringing them back to life, and then watching them die again. Toppin would administer a drug mixture to her chosen victims, hold them close, and lay with them as they passed away. Toppin is often labeled an angel of mercy killer, a type of serial killer who assumes a caregiving role and preys on the vulnerable. However, her murders seem to have also been driven by more personal reasons, such as in the case of the Davis family, or possibly out of jealousy, as seen with the death of her foster sister. She later explained her actions as a result of a loss of control, describing an overwhelming urge to poison. In addition to murder, Toppin reportedly used poison for personal gain, such as when she poisoned a housekeeper just enough to make her appear drunk, allowing Toppin to take her job and ultimately kill the family. Toppin even poisoned herself at times to gain the sympathy of men who were courting her. Along with her partner, Ian Brady, Hindley was responsible for the sexual assault and murder of 5 children in the 1960s in the UK, known as the Morse murders. Myra Hindley was born on July 23, 1942, in the town of Hattersley, Cheshire, England. She grew up in a dysfunctional and abusive household. Her father, a violent alcoholic, and her mother, who was distant and unsympathetic, created a difficult environment for her. Hindley struggled with her upbringing, but she was considered intelligent and capable in her early life. Hindley worked as a secretary, and in 1961, she met Ian Brady, a man with a dark and dangerous personality. The couple quickly formed a bond that would evolve into a partnership in crime. The Morse murders. Between 1963 and 1965, Hindley and Brady kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered 5 children and young adults in the Manchester area. They targeted vulnerable victims and lured them into situations where they were abducted and taken to isolated locations on the moors. The victims. Pauline Redd, 16, on July 12, 1963, Pauline was abducted by Hindley and Brady after leaving her house to attend a dance. She was taken to the moors, where she was raped and murdered. Her body was not discovered until 1987. John Kilbride, 12, on November 23, 1963, John was abducted while walking home from a market. Brady and Hindley drove him to the moors, where he was sexually assaulted, murdered, and buried. His body was found in 1965. Keith Bennett, 12, on June 16, 1964, Keith was abducted by Hindley and Brady while on his way to his grandmother's house. Like the others, he was taken to the moors, where he was murdered. Keith's body was never found, despite extensive searches. Leslie Ann Downey, 10. On December 26, 1964, Hindley and Brady abducted Leslie, who had been out Christmas shopping. They took her to their home, where they filmed her being tortured and murdered. Her body was discovered on the moors shortly after. Edith Winnie Smith, 17. Edith was the final victim of the Morse murders. She was abducted in 1965, sexually assaulted, and killed by Brady and Hindley. Her body was found later that year. The murders remained unsolved until 1965, when Hindley and Brady were arrested. The couple initially managed to avoid detection, but the breakthrough came when Hindley's brother-in-law, David Smith, who had witnessed the abuse and murder of Leslie Ann Downey, came forward to the police. Smith's testimony was crucial in breaking the case. He reported to police that he had seen Brady and Hindley with Leslie and later overheard them discussing her murder. This led to their arrest and the subsequent discovery of their involvement in the other murders. In 1966, Brady and Hindley were convicted of the murders of Leslie Ann Downey, John Kilbride, and Pauline Redd, while Hindley was also charged for the murder of Keith Bennett. Brady was sentenced to life imprisonment and later transferred to a high-security psychiatric hospital. Hindley was given a life sentence, which she would serve for over 30 years. Throughout the trial, Hindley insisted that she was under Brady's influence and claimed that she was manipulated into participating in the murders. She initially denied any involvement in the actual killings, but over time, she admitted her role in the crimes, though she continued to claim that she had been under Brady's coercion. Hindley's role in the murders was often debated. Some considered her an equal participant in the killings, while others viewed her as a victim of Brady's manipulation. Hindley's demeanor during her trial and later in prison was a subject of public scrutiny, as she appeared remorseless in some interviews, though she later expressed regret for her actions. In the years following her conviction, Hindley reportedly sought redemption, claiming that she was deeply remorseful for her involvement in the murders. She worked in prison, eventually becoming involved in educational and rehabilitative activities. However, despite her attempts to demonstrate remorse, many felt that her true motivations remained unclear. Hindley spent over 30 years in prison before she was granted several parole hearings, though she was consistently denied release. Her continued imprisonment was a source of public controversy, with many feeling that she should never be released due to the horrific nature of the crimes. On November 15, 2002, Myra Hindley died of a heart attack at the age of 60. She had been suffering from a long-term heart condition. Her death marked the end of a notorious chapter in British criminal history. The Morse murders shocked the nation, and Hindley, alongside Ian Brady, became infamous as one of the most depraved pairs of serial killers in British history. The case still haunts the families of the victims, especially since Keith Bennett's body was never recovered. Despite her expressions of remorse later in life, many believe that Hindley's involvement in the murders was driven by her devotion to Brady and a shared sadistic ideology. Her case continues to provoke debate about the nature of evil, manipulation, and criminal responsibility. Hindley's crimes and her life in prison remain a subject of fascination for many, and the Morse murders have become one of the most infamous true crime stories in the UK. A convicted murderer who, along with her lover, killed her husband in the 1920s in New York. Her execution was famously captured in a photograph. Ruth Snyder was born on May 22, 1895, in New York City. She grew up in a middle-class family, and after high school, she worked as a secretary and in other office jobs. Ruth was described as attractive but restless, longing for excitement and more glamorous opportunities. In 1923, Ruth married Albert Snyder, a successful businessman who worked in the insurance industry. While their marriage seemed outwardly stable, Ruth was dissatisfied with her life and began an affair with a man named Judd Gray, a corset salesman. Gray was much more exciting to Ruth, and the two quickly became lovers. By 1927, Ruth's dissatisfaction with her marriage to Albert had reached its peak. She felt trapped in her dull, suburban life with Albert, and her affair with Judd Gray intensified. Ruth and Judd began to discuss the possibility of murdering Albert so they could be together without the burden of her marriage. The plan was meticulously plotted. Ruth and Judd decided to kill Albert while he was asleep. On March 31, 1927, Ruth lured her husband into a false sense of security by asking him to take a nap after a long day. After Albert fell asleep, Ruth and Judd made their move. They used a piece of cloth to tie Albert's hands and feet to the bed. Ruth then passed her husband's keys to Judd, who used them to retrieve a revolver from Albert's nightstand. After a brief struggle, Albert was shot and killed. Ruth then staged the scene to make it appear as though Albert had been murdered during a robbery gone wrong. She even went so far as to break into a nearby closet and move items around to create the illusion of a violent home invasion. At first, Ruth's story seemed convincing. She claimed to have been out shopping when the robbery occurred, and upon returning, she found her husband's body. She told police that Albert had been shot during the robbery. However, there were inconsistencies in her story from the very beginning. For example, Ruth had said she was shopping, but police later discovered that she hadn't been at the stores she mentioned. Police also began to grow suspicious of Ruth's relationship with Judd. The couple's affair was no secret, and it wasn't long before investigators started questioning the pair about their involvement in the murder. Ruth and Judd initially denied any wrongdoing, but under intense questioning, both of them cracked. Judd Gray admitted to being part of the murder plot, and he claimed that Ruth had orchestrated the entire crime. Ruth, at first, denied involvement, but eventually confessed to her role in the murder, though she continued to insist that she had acted out of desperation and fear of Albert's temper. Ruth Snyder and Judd Gray were both arrested and charged with the murder of Albert Snyder. The trial began in 1927, and the case quickly became a media sensation. Ruth's cold and calculated demeanor, coupled with her affair with Judd, fascinated the public. Ruth's appearance and behavior were widely discussed in the press, and she was depicted as the archetype of a femme fatale. A key part of the trial was the involvement of the press, which eagerly covered the case. Ruth's actions were scrutinized in great detail, and the media made much of her betrayal of her husband. The prosecution presented Ruth as a woman who had manipulated her lover to murder her husband for the sake of her own desires, while Ruth's defense attorneys tried to paint her as a victim of her circumstances, claiming that she had been pushed to crime by her difficult marriage. Ruth was found guilty of first-degree murder, and Judd Gray was also convicted. Both were sentenced to death. Ruth Snyder's case became even more infamous when she was executed on January 12, 1928, in Sing Sing Prison in New York. What made her execution so notorious was the photograph taken during the event. A photographer named Tom Howard managed to secretly snap a photograph of Ruth in the electric chair moments before she was executed. The image, which captured Ruth's face just before her death, was published in newspapers across the country, further cementing her place in criminal history. The photograph of Ruth Snyder's execution became one of the most infamous images of the 20th century. It captured the cold finality of Ruth's actions and served as a grim reminder of the consequences of her crime. Ruth Snyder's case continues to fascinate people to this day. She is often cited as one of the early examples of the femme fatale archetype, a woman who uses her charm and manipulative nature to cause harm. The case remains one of the most well-known in true crime history, in part due to the chilling photograph of her execution. Ruth Snyder's crime and her execution reflect the complex and often dark dynamics of relationships, obsession, and the consequences of taking matters into one's own hands. The case remains a part of true crime lore, continuing to intrigue and disturb those who learn of it. From manipulative charm to outright violence, these women show us that evil knows no gender. Their stories remind us that darkness can hide behind even the most innocent facades. Which of these stories shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe.